The 11:45 out of London didn't rattle, it hummed with a sick, mechanical precision. I was sitting in car 4, staring at the back of a man's head. He hadn't turned around since we left the station. The rain was drumming against the glass, a rhythmic, maddening sound that felt like it was trying to sync with my own pulse. I stood up, the floorboards groaning under the weight of a silence that shouldn't exist in a crowded train. I walked to the man, tapped his shoulder, and watched the world fold in on itself. He didn't turn, he tipped. The momentum carried his torso forward, and he hit the floor with a hollow, wet thud that killed the sound of the rain. I flipped him over, my fingers sinking into what should have been a chest cavity. There was no bone, no heart, no lungs. Just a seam of jagged, surgical thread pulling together a cavity stuffed with cold, wet entrails that weren't his. I looked up. Every passenger in the car was sitting perfectly still, their eyes fixed on empty air, their skin the color of curdled milk. I tore through the train, car by car, finding the same grisly theater. A conductor in the galley with his throat stitched shut with piano wire. A woman in first class with her internal organs rearranged into an intricate, grotesque bouquet. Then, the silence broke. A gramophone in the conductor's cabin crackled to life, the needle scratching against a worn, black disc. Fantomas's voice poured out, not a shout, but a low, velvet hum that crawled up my spine. He was laughing, a sound so dry it felt like sandpaper on my brain. I reached the cockpit and found it empty. The throttle was locked, the brakes were sabotaged, and ahead, the track simply ended where the bridge over the gorge had been erased. I saw a dark shape on the roof, a silhouette backlit by a lightning flash. He opened a black umbrella, stepped into the void, and vanished into the night, leaving me to watch the speedometer climb toward a death that was now my only traveling companion. My hands were slick with the conductor's blood, and the smell was already turning metallic, sharp, and invasive. I didn't have time for the terror to set in, the train shrieked, the wheels grinding against the steel as the bridge gap approached. I kicked the door open. The wind was a physical force, cold and jagged, slapping me hard across the face. The dark abyss of the gorge yawned beneath, a hungry, black mouth waiting for the iron beast I was trapped in. Fantomas knew this. He had choreographed the trajectory, the speed, the very moment of impact. He didn't just want me dead, he wanted me to witness the final seconds of a masterpiece. I could hear the bridge's support screaming under the vibration as we neared the edge. I looked back at the car 4, where the dead sat in their grotesque tableau, their stitched faces mocking my frantic survival instinct. I didn't think, I threw myself off the side. The impact with the muddy slope was like hitting a wall of wet stone. I tumbled, bones snapping in protest, until the darkness swallowed me whole. Above, the train met the void, a deafening explosion of iron and fire that lit up the rain-slicked sky like a dying star. I lay there in the mud, gasping for air, the taste of cold earth in my mouth, realizing that the game hadn't ended. It had just been set in motion. He was out there in the rain, watching the fire, waiting to see if I was worth the effort of another act. And in the distance, I heard the faint, rhythmic scratching of that gramophone again, drifting through the storm, taunting me to get up and finish the show. I crawled toward the tree line, my blood warm against the biting, freezing air, knowing that London was now the only stage left for the nightmare that was just beginning to breathe. I didn't die. I jumped. I hit the muddy embankment of the gorge just as the train turned into a fireball of twisted iron, shattered glass, and the stench of burning, synthetic meat. The heat was a physical blow, a sudden, searing gust that scorched the damp air and sent me tumbling further down into the darkness. I crawled through the freezing, viscous sludge of the riverbank, the smell of burnt hair and copper hanging heavy in the wet night. Every muscle in my body felt like it had been shredded by glass, but the cold, that biting, insistent London cold, was the only thing keeping me conscious. It bit into my skin, demanding I move, demanding I survive just to suffer a little longer. I walked for what felt like hours, my boots heavy with river muck, until the flickering, jaundiced lights of a rural station appeared through the veil of rain. I thought I was safe. I thought I could find a phone, a signal, someone who wasn't a doll stitched together by a madman. I stumbled onto the platform, my lungs burning, the rain washing the blood from my face only to replace it with the soot of the wreckage. The station master was waiting under the rusted eaves of the roof. He was holding a heavy iron lantern, his face obscured by the deep, jagged brim of his hat. I collapsed toward him, my voice a ragged, broken plea for help, but he didn't reach out to steady me. He just stood there, motionless, like a statue carved out of the city's own misery. As he stepped into the weak, trembling light of the lantern, I felt the air leave my lungs. He wasn't a man, he was a canvas. Fantomas had turned his entire face into a mask of grafted, overlapping skin, pulled so tight across the bone that it looked like a skull wrapped in wet, translucent parchment. The stitches were thick, dark, and festering, zigzagging across his eyelids and lips in a pattern that made my vision blur with nausea. He didn't speak. He just held out a heavy, leather suitcase, the kind used by traveling physicians. His fingers, covered in the same scarred, mismatched skin, twitched with a nervous, electric energy. I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against the freezing wood of the platform, but he simply took a step forward, the lantern swinging to reveal the contents of the case as he popped the brass latches. Inside weren't tools, or clothes, or anything a man would carry. It was filled with jars. Dozens of them, nested in velvet like fine jewelry. Each one contained a single, severed human ear, bobbing in a clear, preservative fluid. They were labeled in precise, elegant script with a name and a date. My name was on the very last one. I didn't wait for him to explain the collection. I drew my service pistol, the metal biting into my frozen palm, and fired. The blast ripped through the silence of the night, tearing a hole through his shoulder, sending him spinning against a stack of crates. But he didn't scream. He didn't even fall. He just tilted his head, the stitches on his neck pulling taut as he adjusted his balance with an unnatural, fluid grace. "You're late for the exhibit, Inspector," he whispered, his voice sounding like it was coming from inside my own throat, a dry, rasping echo of my own thoughts. He dropped the lantern. The fire didn't just spread, it roared, consuming the wooden platform in an instant, turning the station into a funeral pyre of ancient grease and dry timber. I turned and ran, my boots splashing through the icy, tooth-filled puddles, the heat licking at my heels like a predatory animal. The platform burned behind me, a bright, jagged signal fire for a predator that didn't need to hunt because he already knew exactly where I was going to land. I reached the darkness of the trees, my breath coming in jagged, freezing gasps, and looked back once. He was still standing in the heart of the flames, watching me. He wasn't reaching for a weapon, he was just watching, his gloved hands folded over the suitcase, waiting for the next act to unfold in the sprawling, indifferent theater of the city. I realized then that the fire wasn't meant to kill me, it was meant to illuminate the path he wanted me to take. I was being herded, step by step, deeper into the trap, and every heartbeat was just another tick of the clock he had set in motion long before I ever stepped foot on that train. London wasn't waiting for me, it was hiding. I slipped back into the city through the back alleys of Whitechapel, the fog so thick and greasy it felt like I was breathing in wet, discarded wool. Every brick wall looked like a face, every stagnant puddle reflected a truth I wasn't ready to see. I reached my safe house, a cold, cramped room that smelled of stale tobacco and deep-seated regret. I needed to think, to piece together the insanity of the station, but my mind felt like a film reel that kept jumping frames. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside, watching the rain carve jagged, map-like patterns into the grime on the window. That's when the first photograph was slipped under the door. It was me, sitting in that very chair, taken no more than 5 minutes ago. Then another slid through the gap. Me, sleeping in the safe house. Then another. Me, stumbling through the mud at the station. Phantomas wasn't just watching, he was documenting. He was building an exhaustive archive of my unraveling. I grabbed the door handle, burst into the hallway, and found the entire floor lined with mirrors. They were everywhere. Not just plain mirrors, but ones he had installed, each one angled with mathematical precision to show me a different, hideous version of my own face, me as a killer, me as a victim, me as a corpse with my eyes sewn shut. I swung my fist into the glass, the shards slicing my knuckles to the bone, the cold, dark blood dripping onto the floorboards. But the mirrors didn't break the way I expected. They peeled away like dead skin, revealing a room behind the walls that was filled with nothing but clocks. Thousands of them. All of them stopped at the exact same second, the moment of the crash. The air in the room was electric, heavy with the ozone scent of a pending, violent disaster. A shadow shifted in the far corner, tall and thin, his coat trailing on the ground like a funeral shroud. He didn't attack. He didn't even acknowledge my presence. He just stood there, holding a long, silver scalpel, waiting for me to realize that in this city, the only thing more dangerous than being found by him was being forgotten by him. I lunged at the shadow, my hands grasping at thin air, my vision swimming with the pain in my knuckles. I hit the wall, and the entire room seemed to vibrate with a low, mechanical hum. I realized then that the safe house wasn't just a place to hide, it was a node in his network. Every clock, every mirror, every shadow in this district was connected to his will. He had turned the very architecture of London into his instrument. I pulled back, panting, the cold air biting at my lungs, and saw him step out of the shadows. He didn't have the station master's mask, but he had something worse, a face that looked like a blurred long-exposure photograph, features shifting and sliding as if they couldn't decide on a shape. "You think you're hunting me, Inspector," the creature whispered, the sound vibrating in the floorboards beneath my feet. "You're not even the protagonist. You're just the ink." He moved with a speed that defied physics, his hand flashing out to touch my forehead. The sensation wasn't pain, it was an injection of pure, raw data. I saw the city as he saw it, a massive, rotting carcass of secrets, each building a lung, each street a vein, all of it pulsing with the filth of 1,000 hidden crimes. I collapsed to my knees, my mind reeling under the weight of the vision. He walked to the window, opened it, and looked out over the fog-drenched city. "Tonight, the city wakes up," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "And you, Inspector, are going to be the first one to truly see it." He vanished into the mist, leaving me alone in the room of stopped clocks, the silence pressing against my ears until I thought my skull would crack. I stood up, my legs shaking, and looked at the door. I knew I couldn't stay here, but I also knew that everywhere I went, he would be there, not as a man, but as the very fabric of the city itself. The hunt had changed. I was no longer the hunter, I was the prey in a maze that was actively being constructed around me, one memory at a time. I tracked him to a private anatomy theater in the bowels of the city, a place where the air tasted like formaldehyde and ancient, unresolved secrets. The place was packed, not with people, but with mannequins dressed in the stolen clothes of the city's elite. They were positioned in a frozen gala, a silent banquet of wax and hollow interiors. Phantomas was at the center, standing over a heavy oak table, his hands moving with the grace of a concert pianist. He wasn't killing, he was refining. He looked up as I stepped into the light, his eyes meeting mine without a shred of malice or recognition. He was stitching a velvet ribbon into the neck of a mannequin, the needle flashing under the low, flickering gaslight. "The problem with humanity, Inspector, is that it's too messy," he said, not pausing his work, his fingers dancing through the fabric and flesh. "We spend our whole lives trying to look consistent, to look like we have a shape. But inside, we're just liquids and tension, held together by the flimsy hope that nobody notices the cracks. He turned the mannequin around. It was a perfect, sickening replica of the mayor's wife, down to the intricate lace at the throat. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, ticking device, planting it firmly into the mannequin's chest. I leveled my gun at him, the barrel steady, but he didn't even look at the weapon. "The bomb won't blow up the room," he said, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, gravelly whisper. "It'll just broadcast the truth." He pressed a button, and the mannequin's jaw dropped, and a voice, the mayor's wife's own voice, began reciting a litany of every secret, every bribe, every sordid betrayal she had committed for the last decade. It was deafening. It was glorious. The words poured out of the wax figure like bile, spilling into the room, echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. I stood there, paralyzed, as the mannequin confessed to crimes that would burn the city to the ground. It was every lie the establishment had ever told, stripped of its polish and delivered in a steady, monotonous drone. I could have pulled the trigger. I could have ended him right then and there. But my finger wouldn't move. I was mesmerized by the sheer, cold beauty of his cruelty. He wasn't just destroying people, he was exposing the architecture of their hypocrisy. "The truth is a structural weakness, Inspector," he said, stepping into the shadows of the Anatomy Theater. "Once you see it, the whole building has to come down." He vanished into the dark corners of the hall, leaving me surrounded by a dozen mannequins, all of them starting to speak, all of them screaming the secrets of the people I had sworn to protect. The sound was a cacophony of admissions, corruption, murder, adultery, greed, all colliding in the sterile air of the theater. I grabbed the mayor's wife's mannequin, trying to rip the device out, but the metal was searing hot, burning my palms. I stumbled back, my hands raw, watching as the wax face began to melt under the intensity of the broadcast. The theater felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in as the confessions grew louder, more frantic. I realized then that he wasn't just using the mannequins, he was using me. I was the audience he needed to validate his work. I turned and ran, the echoes of the city's sins following me into the hallway, the sound of a dozen voices laughing in unison as I plunged back into the cold, rainy streets, realizing that I was carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets that nobody would ever believe. The city outside was quiet, but I could feel the tremor in the ground, the first cracks in the foundation of the world he was preparing to dismantle, and I was the only one with the map to the ruins. As I fled through the winding, slick alleys, the voices pursued me, a persistent, phantom chorus vibrating through the gas pipes and rattling the very bricks of the tenements. Every shadow seemed to hold the silhouette of a mannequin, watching with frozen, accusatory eyes. My lungs burned, yet I could not stop, the gravity of what I had heard pinned me forward, a captive to the impending collapse. I reached the riverbank, looking back at the skyline where the spires of justice and finance stood like tombstone markers over the city's grave. Fantomas was not a villain in the traditional sense, he was a storm, a force of nature that had arrived to scour the rot from the world's bones. I clutched the rough stone of the bridge, staring down at the black, swirling water that mirrored the darkness in my soul. I understood now that I was no longer an inspector, nor was I a guardian of the law. I was merely a witness to an extinction event. The map he had left in my mind was not one of escape, but of surrender. The city was destined to dissolve, and I was simply the vessel meant to record the final, agonizing notes of its swan song before the silence reclaimed everything. The city was starting to tear itself apart, just as he planned. The scandals he broadcasted were fueling a rage that the police couldn't contain, and the streets were turning into a sea of gray coats and desperate, terrified faces. I found myself in the middle of a riot, the air thick with the smell of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The mob was a single, hulking beast, moving blindly through the fog, smashing windows and dragging the city's highborn from their carriages. I ducked into a doorway, my chest heaving, the cold rain soaking through my jacket, chilling me to the bone. That's when the sky began to change. It wasn't rain falling anymore. It was hard, small, white objects clattering against the cobblestones. I looked down and saw a pile of human teeth, hundreds of them, cascading from the rooftops like hail. The crowd stopped screaming and started looking up, their expressions shifting from pure rage to a primal, frozen horror. I looked up and saw him standing on the cornice of the clock tower, his silhouette framed against the moon. He was emptying a heavy burlap sack, his movements slow, rhythmic, and deliberate. He wasn't looking at me, but I felt the weight of his gaze tracking my heartbeat. I scrambled away, sliding on the slick, tooth-covered pavement, my mind reeling. Why teeth? It was the most intimate, most permanent part of the human body. He was littering the city with the remains of his patience, turning the street into a graveyard of grins. I made it to an alleyway and saw him jump again, landing on the wet asphalt without a sound, his boots leaving dark stains on the ivory-white ground. He walked toward me, his coat flapping in the wind like a wounded bird, a long, thin blade glinting in the pale street lamplight. He wasn't rushing. He was letting the sheer, unadulterated panic of the city do the work for him. I stood my ground, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the pistol, realizing that in his world, you didn't need to be afraid of the monster, you needed to be afraid of the fact that he was the only thing in this city that made any sense. He stopped 5 paces away. The rain hissed against his coat. "The harvest is early this year, Inspector," he said, his voice as smooth as polished bone. He gestured to the street, now carpeted in white. Every one of these was a secret that bit back. Every one of them was a silence I had to extract. I raised the gun, but my arm felt like it was carved from lead. The atmosphere in the alley was suffocating, heavy with the weight of his presence. He wasn't just a man, he was a storm, a focused point of destruction that had decided to unravel the social fabric of London, one molar at a time. I fired, but the shot went wide, shattering a crate behind him. He didn't even flinch. He just watched the wood splinter, his expressionless mask barely moving. He took another step, the sound of his boots crushing a tooth into the mud, a small, sharp sound that echoed like a gunshot. "You look tired, Inspector," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. "You're trying to defend a city that has already committed suicide. You're just the only one left who hasn't realized the heart stopped beating." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth of his mission. He wasn't trying to destroy the city, he was trying to autopsy it while it was still technically moving. I backed away, my heel catching on the uneven cobblestones, and plunged into the darkness of the next alley. I could hear him walking behind me, the rhythmic, sickening crunch of teeth under his boots keeping time with my desperate, ragged heartbeat. I wasn't just running from a killer anymore, I was running from the realization that everything I had fought to protect was already a corpse, and I was just the final witness to the decay. His shadow lengthened, stretching unnaturally across the walls like ink bleeding through parchment. I realized then that my pursuit had never been a chase, but a slow, calculated lure into his operating theater of asphalt and ruin. He knew every turn I would take, every desperate breath I would draw, as if he had authored the very geometry of my terror. The city groaned in the distance, a dying giant losing its grip on the horizon, while he remained calm, a surgeon amidst the carnage. I reached a dead end, a brick wall slick with the city's weeping, and turned to face him. He didn't raise his blade, he simply extended a hand, palm open, as if offering me a place at the altar of this grand, horrific conclusion. I dropped my weapon, the metal clattering uselessly against the teeth, and understood that in this absolute endgame, the only crime left was to keep believing in a morning that would never come. I managed to lose him in the labyrinth of the sewers, the air thick with the smell of stagnant rot and ancient, unresolved waste. I was shivering, the cold finally seeping into my marrow, turning my blood into sludge. I needed a lead, something to break his hold, something to prove that this nightmare had a seam I could rip open. I stumbled into a hidden chamber, a vaulted space that looked like a blueprint of the entire city. It was Fantomas's workshop. The walls were covered in architectural drawings, but they weren't for buildings. They were diagrams of social structures, maps of betrayals, and blueprints of how to collapse a reputation. I saw my own name on a desk, next to a detailed, chilling drawing of my life, my birth, my failures, the precise moment my father died, and my eventual, inevitable death. He had it all plotted out, every miserable twist and turn. I grabbed the heavy ledger, the pages thin as onion skin, and started to read. He wasn't just a criminal, he was an author. He was writing the city's final chapter, and we were all just characters waiting for our cues, bound by the ink he spilled. I heard a scraping sound behind the wall, a vibration that made the blueprints rattle against the damp stone. I realized then that the workshop wasn't just a room, it was part of the city's very foundation. He hadn't just studied London, he had woven himself into its infrastructure, into the pipes, the foundations, the very breathing space of the streets. He was the city's rot, its secret history, its silent, beating heart. I stared at the blueprint of my own death and realized it was dated for tonight, at the very hour the clock tower would chime. I didn't wait to see if he was coming. I ran for the exit, my heart hammering a rhythm that felt like a countdown, knowing that I wasn't just trying to catch a killer anymore, I was trying to rewrite a story that was already written in ink, blood, and the cold, unyielding stone of London. The tunnel narrowed, the walls slick with a foul, black slime that seemed to pulse in time with my own panic. I reached a rusted iron grate and kicked it, the metal groaning before giving way to a damp, midnight alleyway. I looked up at the sky, expecting to see the stars, but all I saw was a thick, suffocating blanket of charcoal clouds. The city felt different now, it felt like a cage I had helped build, a trap designed specifically for my own ego. I realized that my pursuit of Fantomas was the very engine driving his plot. My resistance was the fuel. Every time I tried to stop him, I was merely confirming his theory that the world was a machine built for suffering. I walked out into the open street, the rain starting to fall again, but it felt different. It didn't wash away the filth, it only made the shadows longer, deeper, and more hungry. I saw a group of men standing under a lamp, their faces obscured, their posture identical, waiting for something that I had already set in motion. They were his observers, the silent agents of his narrative. I drew my weapon, but it felt like a toy, a plastic prop in a play where the lead actor held all the strings. I had to get to the tower. I had to stop the sequence before the final page was turned. I started to run, the sound of my own footsteps echoing against the buildings like a taunt. I wasn't running toward justice anymore, I was running toward an ending I had been auditioning for my entire life, and as I turned the corner, I felt the cold, familiar hand of the city reach out to grab me, dragging me deeper into the script that Fantomas had written in the dark corners of my own mind. I didn't know if I could change the outcome, but I knew I had to be there for the finish. The city was silent, but in that silence, I could hear the grinding of the gears, the slow, inevitable movement of a trap that was finally, after all these years, ready to snap shut, and I was the only thing left inside. Above me, the clock tower began its mournful, heavy toll, each metallic strike vibrating through the marrow of my bones like a sentence being passed by an uncaring God. The streets groaned in sympathy, the very paving stones shifting to block my path, forcing me toward the plaza where he stood waiting in the epicenter of the grand, orchestrated collapse. My reflection caught in a rain-slicked window looked not like an investigator, but like a ghost already haunting the ruins of his own history, finally comprehending that the ink of my fate had been dry for decades. I emerged from the sewers into the pulsating center of the city, only to find that the streets had shifted into something unrecognizable. The geometry was all wrong, the buildings leaned in like jagged teeth, the alleys twisted into impossible knots, and the entire layout of London felt like a grand clockwork mechanism designed to grind down anything with a pulse. I reached the clock tower, the monolithic spire that stood as the grim anchor of the district. I climbed the stairs, the air getting thinner, the smell of burnt oil and grease replacing the rain-washed air. At the top, in the belfry that overlooked the shivering city, I found the heart of the beast, a massive, ticking machine. The gears were larger than a man, grinding with a sound like bone hitting bone. And there, sitting inside the primary gear housing, was Phantomas. He was disassembling his own hand, replacing fingers with metal tools, his movements rhythmic and clinical. He looked up, his face a mask of smooth, polished porcelain. "You're running out of time, Inspector," he said, his voice sounding like stones rubbing together. "The city needs a heartbeat, and the old one is dying. It needs a pulse that doesn't falter." He pulled a long, rusted lever, and the tower groaned. I saw the gears shifting, the weight of the tower pulling the city toward a catastrophic realignment. I realized he wasn't trying to destroy London, he was trying to optimize it. He wanted to strip away the humanity, the messy variables of life, and turn it into something permanent, something he could control. He was the ultimate curator, and we were the exhibits he was refining for an audience of none. I leveled my gun at the central gear, knowing if I destroyed it, the tower would fall, and I would be buried with him in a tomb of iron. "Do it," he whispered, a hint of chilling excitement in his voice. "Break the rhythm. See what happens when the city finally stops." I hesitated, looking out over the millions of lives below. If I stopped him, I was destroying their order. If I let him continue, I was confirming my own erasure. I saw the gears turning, each tooth locking into place with absolute certainty. The tower began to vibrate, the sound rising to a shriek that rattled my teeth. He stood up, the metal tools glinting, and glided toward me. I wasn't just facing a criminal, I was facing the end of the human experiment. I pulled the trigger, the shot muffled by the roar, and watched as a slug tore through the primary gear. The tower shuddered, iron grinding, iron screaming. We were thrown to the floor as the mechanism tore itself apart, weights falling, chains snapping like vipers. Phantomas was pinned under a beam, his mask cracking, showing a glimpse of the nothingness beneath, no face, no history, just a dark, swirling void. I crawled toward him, my head ringing, the rain finding its way through the windows, creating a slick pool of oil and blood. I looked into the crack in his porcelain face and saw the reflection of the city, burning and collapsing. But it wasn't the city I knew. It was a world stripped bare, where every secret was visible, where every person was a transparent marionette. He didn't look defeated. He looked satisfied. He grabbed my wrist, his strength far beyond possible, his fingers sinking into my flesh like needles. "You think you stopped me?" he rasped, the void behind the mask swirling with a mocking light. "You just opened the shutter. Now, everyone will see what I see. You've just made yourself the star of the final act, Inspector. And I'm the only one left who knows how it ends." The tower lurched, the floor tilting, and I had to make a choice, save myself or watch the collapse. I pulled my wrist free, but as I turned to run, I caught a glimpse of myself in a shard of glass. I wasn't looking at my own face. I was looking at a blank space, a mask, the exact same mask he wore. He hadn't just rewritten the city, he had rewritten me. I was the gear he needed to replace the broken one. I was the heartbeat he had been searching for, and the gears were already beginning to turn again, hungry for my sacrifice. As I fled down the spiraling stairs, the porcelain mask on my face seemed to harden, locking my expression into a permanent, chilling gaze of indifference. I could hear the city below starting to tick in a new, rhythmic, and terrifyingly efficient way, signaling that the master's final, silent clockwork design had finally and irrevocably claimed us all. I didn't die in the fall. I hit the wooden floor of the belfry, the impact knocking the breath out of my lungs, but the structure held just long enough for me to scramble toward the edge. The tower was shuddering, a rhythmic, violent convulsing that felt like the building itself was suffering a seizure. I looked down into the crater of the mechanism. Phantomas was gone. The beam that had pinned him was now resting on a pile of shattered iron, and the porcelain mask lay shattered in a dozen pieces, mocking me with its emptiness. I felt a cold, phantom sensation on my wrist where he had gripped me, a lingering trace of that unnatural, needle-like strength. I dragged myself to the window, the rain lashing against my face, and looked out over the skyline. London was changing. It wasn't just the collapse, it was a transition. Below me, the city streets were filling with people who had stopped moving, stopped speaking, and stopped being human. They were standing perfectly still, their faces turned upward toward the tower, their eyes reflecting the same hollow, porcelain emptiness I had seen in his mask. I scrambled down the spiral staircase, my boots slipping on the slick, oil-stained stone. Every level of the tower felt like a layer of a grave. When I reached the ground, the air was dead, no wind, no distant hum of traffic, no bird song. Just the deafening, oppressive quiet of a world that had been muted. I stepped out into the street and found myself walking through a gallery of living statues. A businessman clutched his briefcase, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on a future that would never come. A flower girl sat on the curb, her fingers frozen around a withered stem. I checked my reflection in a nearby store window, and for a terrifying second, I couldn't find myself. My image was a blur, a smudge of gray against the dark, wet glass. I pressed my hand against the pane, and the glass felt warm, not the temperature of a surface, but the temperature of skin. I pulled back, my heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm in the silence. Phantomas hadn't just destroyed the gears, he had integrated the city into his own consciousness. He was the fog, the dampness, the stone, and the stillness. Every citizen was a note in his final, suffocating symphony. I walked toward the river, the water black and sluggish, reflecting the desolate, unlit buildings. I felt a presence behind me, not a shadow, but a shift in the air, a drop in the temperature that made the mist crystallize on my coat. I turned around, my hand instinctively going to my holster, but my side was empty. My gun was gone, lost somewhere in the wreckage of the tower. I stood alone in the center of the bridge, the cold stone biting into my feet through the thin soles of my boots. "You were always the missing piece, Inspector," a voice drifted from the fog, not coming from any direction but from everywhere at once. It was my own voice, but flattened, emptied of all the doubt and fear that had defined my life. "You were the only one who kept looking for a reason, the only one who kept fighting for a purpose in a world that was already finished." I stared into the mist, and I saw him, or what was left of him. He wasn't a man, he was a manifestation of the city's collective despair, a shadow cast by the weight of all the secrets I had tried to uncover. He reached out, his hand dissolving into the fog, and touched my chest, right over my heart. I felt a sudden, sharp coldness spread through my ribs, a numbness that moved with the precision of a scalpel. My pulse stuttered, slowed, and then matched the steady, agonizingly slow tick of the tower's broken clock. I was no longer an observer, I was becoming the architecture. The bridge beneath me seemed to liquefy, the iron becoming soft as clay, the river beneath rising to meet me. I realized that the collapse wasn't a death, it was an absorption. He wasn't killing the city, he was saving it from the mess of living. And as I stared at my own hands, watching them turn the pale, porcelain white of his mask, I understood that there was no way out because there was no out left. There was only the city, the silence, and the eternal, unchanging rhythm of his will. I had tried to stop the ending, but I had only succeeded in becoming the ink he needed to write it. The mystery was gone, replaced by the final, absolute truth of our own obsolescence, and I stood on the bridge, a hollow shell waiting for the next tick, ready to take my place as part of the machine. I woke up in a room that was entirely black. No walls, no floor, no ceiling, just an infinite, suffocating void that smelled of wet asphalt, old iron, and a sterile, medicinal cold that I could taste on my tongue. I wasn't standing, I was suspended, my limbs feeling heavy and distant, as if they belonged to a suit of armor I had forgotten how to wear. I could hear the city outside, not the roar of London, but the distant, muffled thrum of a machine trying to find its rhythm again. But here, in the dark, the play was still ongoing. Fantomas was there, sitting in a velvet chair that seemed to float in the nothingness, watching a massive screen that showed my own memories. My childhood in the countryside, the first time I held a badge, the day I realized the law was a thin, fraying rope, all of it was being played back, meticulously edited, and cruelly distorted. "You want the truth, Inspector," he said, his voice echoing in the void, devoid of any human inflection. "The truth is that you were never the hero of this story. You were the audience. You were the one I specifically curated to witness the final performance." He leaned forward, his face obscured by the flickering, stuttering light of the screen. "Every crime I committed, every stitch I placed, every secret I leaked, was just to prepare you for this exact moment. To make you understand that we aren't individuals with agency. We are just reflections in a mirror that someone else is holding, and the mirror is cracking." He stood up and began to walk around me, his movements fluid, almost hypnotic, his shadow stretching and twisting into shapes that made my eyes ache. "You're not a detective anymore, Inspector. You're the evidence. And now, it's time to be filed away, categorized, and forgotten." He gestured toward the darkness, and the void around us began to shift, forming the spectral shapes of the people I had failed to save during my tenure. They were all there, the victims on the train, the desperate souls from the Anatomy Theater, the lost faces of the city. They were masks, their eyes empty, their expressions fixed in a state of eternal, silent waiting. The performance wasn't for the city anymore, it was for me, a final, torturous review of everything I had allowed to happen. The stage was set, and I was the lead actor in a tragedy that had no audience. I tried to scream, to break the hold he had on my consciousness, but my vocal cords were silent, frozen. I watched as the memories on the screen started to merge with my current reality. I saw my childhood home, but the walls were stitched together with that same, jagged, surgical thread. I saw my first love, but her face was a mask of polished, cracked porcelain. The boundaries between then and now, between reality and nightmare, were entirely gone. I was being unraveled, thread by thread, and Fantomas was the one doing the work with a clinical, detached focus. He didn't use blades anymore, he used the weight of my own past to sharpen the edge. "It's not enough to kill a man, Inspector," he murmured, his hands moving over the air as if playing an invisible instrument, weaving the strands of my life into a tapestry of failure. "You have to unmake him. You have to remove the connections, the memories, the things that make him believe he matters. You have to empty him out until there's nothing left but the hollow echo of his own regret." I watched as my sense of self began to dissolve, the memories of who I was turning into smoke. The name I was given, the lessons I learned, the scars I carried, they all felt like someone else's property, distant and irrelevant. He was stealing my history, and with every bit he took, I became more like the mannequins, more like the statues, more like the void he had shown me earlier. I tried to grab onto something, a thought, a feeling, anything that was mine, but there was nothing left to grasp. I was becoming the perfect spectator, empty, silent, and ready to be displayed. "Look," he whispered, gesturing toward the horizon of the void. The city was finally starting to wake up, but it wasn't the London I knew. It was a place where everyone had stopped lying, stopped pretending, and stopped being human. They were all standing still, waiting for the next scene, a silent army of mannequins in the rain. And I was the one who had to tell them that the play had already ended, but there was no one left to listen. I was the last spark in a cold, dark theater, and the lights were being dimmed one by one. I tried to break the cycle. I tried to scream, to run, to force my way out of the darkness, but the more I resisted, the more the room tightened around me, pinning my arms and legs against the invisible architecture of the void. The memories on the screen started to merge with my current reality. I saw my childhood home, but the walls were made of stitches, the wallpaper peeling back to reveal rows of cold, rusted gears. I saw my first love, but her face was a mask of porcelain, her eyes dark, bottomless pits reflecting a sky that had no stars. The boundaries were gone. I was being unraveled, thread by thread, and Phantomas was the one doing the work with a surgical, terrifying precision. He didn't use blades anymore, he used the weight of my own past. "It's not enough to kill a man," he murmured, his hands moving over the air as if playing an invisible, discordant instrument. "You have to unmake him. You have to remove the connections, the memories, the things that make him believe he matters. You have to empty him out." I watched as my sense of self began to dissolve. The name I was given, the lessons I learned, the scars I carried, they all felt like someone else's property. He was stealing my history, and with every bit he took, I became more like the mannequins, more like the statues, more like the void he had shown me earlier. I tried to grab onto something, a thought, a feeling, anything that was mine, but there was nothing left. I was becoming the perfect spectator, empty, silent, and ready to be displayed. "Look," he whispered, gesturing toward the horizon. The city was finally starting to wake up, but it wasn't the London I knew. It was a place where everyone had stopped lying, stopped pretending, and stopped being human. They were all standing still, waiting for the next scene. And I was the one who had to tell them that the play had already ended. But even that realization felt distant, a fading echo in a room that had no walls. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were becoming translucent, the skin turning into the same gray, oily fog that filled the streets of the city. He wasn't just erasing me, he was absorbing me. I was becoming part of the architecture, a silent gargoyle on a building that would never be finished. I tried to look for Phantomas, but he was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of the silence. I was alone in the void, a prisoner of my own unmaking, watching the city below me begin its final, cold performance. The streets were perfectly aligned, the people perfectly placed, a flawless grid of obedience and stillness. I could feel the city's pulse, a slow, deep thud that vibrated through the foundation of my existence. It was a rhythm that I could no longer resist, a tempo that was calling me home to the machine. I wasn't fighting anymore. The effort had become a memory, something I had discarded long ago. I was finally, truly empty, a vessel waiting to be filled with the cold, unyielding purpose of the void. And in that stillness, I felt the last shred of my humanity flicker and die, replaced by the smooth, porcelain comfort of being nothing at all. The play was perfect, the actors were waiting, and I was the final prop that needed to be set in place before the curtain could rise on a world that would never end. Then, a sudden, blinding clarity struck. I was not the victim of this erasure, but the architect of my own design, having unconsciously willed this absolute stillness into existence as a sanctuary from the relentless noise of consciousness. I saw the gears of the universe begin to rotate, not with hostility, but with an invitation to step into the marrow of reality, where my absence was the final piece required to bring order to the chaos. I surrendered the last atom of my resistance, exhaling a breath that wasn't mine to claim, and felt my spirit snap into alignment with the infinite, silent clockwork of a creation that had waited an eternity for me to stop trying to be anything more than the quiet, observing shadow in its center. I stood in the center of the city, the rain falling on a world that had finally stopped trying. Phantomas was gone. He had vanished the moment I realized that he didn't need to be there to finish the work. The city had finished it for him. People were walking through the streets like ghosts, their faces vacant, their lives reduced to a series of mechanical, inevitable actions. I walked among them, the only one who remembered the before, the only one who still felt the cold and the pain. I went back to the clock tower, the wreckage still smoldering in the damp, heavy air. I found a small, black disc lying in the debris. I put it on a portable player, my hands trembling as the needle dropped. It wasn't his voice this time. It was mine. I was listening to myself, a recording from years ago, talking about justice, about truth, about the hope that the city would change. It sounded like a fairy tale, a story from a world that had never existed. I realized then that he hadn't destroyed the city, he had just revealed the truth about it. We were never living, we were just rehearsing for a collapse that was inevitable. I climbed to the top of the tower, the city spread out beneath me, an endless, intricate machine that was finally running exactly the way it was designed to. There was no more mystery, no more conflict, and no more humanity. There was only the silence, the rain, and the cold, unyielding reality of a world that had nothing left to say. I looked up at the sky, the clouds parting to reveal a moon that looked like a cold, unblinking eye. And for the first time, I understood why he did it. He wasn't a monster. He was a liberator. He had taken away the burden of our humanity and left us with the peace of the void. I felt my own breath hitch, a jagged, unnatural sound in the profound quiet. I reached out to touch the cold stone of the tower, but my fingers passed through it as if I were already a spirit, a memory of a man who once had a name and a duty. I looked down at the streets one last time, seeing the grid of frozen, waiting people. They were waiting for a signal that would never come, a cue for a show that had been cancelled centuries ago. I turned away from the edge, my steps silent on the debris-strewn floor. There was nowhere left to go, nothing left to solve. The tower, the city, and the man I used to be were all dissolving into the same gray, monochromatic landscape. I felt a strange, cold peace, the kind of peace that only comes when you realize that you were never the protagonist of this story, you were just a witness, a ghost, a remnant of a world that wasn't meant to last. The city ticked on, not because it was alive, but because it had to. And I, the detective who tried to catch a shadow, was finally standing in the dark, watching the final act play out to an empty house. The mystery was solved, the truth was enthroned, and the silence was the only language left to speak. The curtain had fallen, and there was no one left to applaud, no one left to remember that we had ever been anything other than shadows in a rain-drenched nightmare. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see anything. Just the cold, beautiful, perfect absence of everything. Even the sensation of falling, which I had expected to accompany my final dissolution, never arrived. Instead, I simply permeated the structure of the city, my consciousness bleeding into the iron, the granite, and the very atmosphere that once weighed so heavily upon my lungs. I was now the clockwork's quiet oil, the damp seep in the cellar, and the hollow echo in the alleyways where hope once dared to linger. I was no longer an observer of the tragedy, but the stage itself, a vast and indifferent canvas where time no longer possessed a direction or a destination. The cycle of the detective, the hunt, and the inevitable discovery had been permanently overwritten by the static, crystalline grace of non-existence, allowing me to finally drift away from the wreckage of my own identity, dissolving into the glorious, unending dark where not even the memory of a name could find a place to anchor. I am the silence between the gears, the pause before a breath is never taken, and the absolute, final resolution to a mystery that I have, at last, stopped trying to solve. I am the last one left. I sit in the tower, the machine at my feet, the city beneath me. The rain has stopped, and the air is perfectly still, a cold, crystalline silence that stretches from the river to the stars. I have nothing to do, nothing to think, and nothing to feel. I am the observer, the archivist of a world that has reached its terminal point. I watch the people in the streets, the statues of salt and regret, and I realize that the play isn't over. It just doesn't need an audience anymore. We are all part of the set now. We are the history, the failure, and the evidence. The mystery is buried in the deepest, most secure vault in the city, and the key has been turned for the last time. I don't feel regret. I don't feel fear. I feel a strange, cold peace, the kind of peace that only comes when you realize that you were never the protagonist of this story. You were just a witness, a ghost, a remnant of a world that wasn't meant to last. The city ticks on, not because it's alive, but because it has to. The gears turn because they are built to turn, and the rain falls because the sky has nowhere else to put its sorrow. I stand up and walk to the window. The skyline of London is jagged and sharp against the pale, sickly light of the dawn. It looks like a diagram of a nervous system that has been disconnected from the brain. I reach out and touch the frame of the window, and I can feel the cold metal vibrating with a deep, subsonic frequency. It is the sound of the city breathing, a mechanical, rhythmic inhale and exhale that marks the passage of time in a world where time no longer matters. I see a shadow moving in the alley below, but I know it isn't Phantomas. It's just another reflection, another piece of the script playing out its final, redundant cycle. I go back to the desk, the wood scarred and rotting, and I pick up the pen. There is no ink left, but I begin to write anyway, the nib scratching against the paper, leaving behind nothing but thin, white lines. I am recording the silence. I am documenting the void. I am the final entry in a ledger that no one will ever read. I look at my hands again, and they are almost entirely gone now, just faint outlines in the dim light of the belfry. I am becoming part of the tower, part of the mechanism, part of the quiet, beautiful decay. The mystery is solved, the truth is enthroned, and the silence is the only language left to speak. The game is over, and the void has finally won. I close my eyes, and for the first time, I don't see anything. Just the cold, beautiful, perfect absence of everything. The curtain has fallen, and there is no one left to applaud, no one left to mourn, and no one left to be afraid of the dark. I am finally, truly, nothing. The tower chimes once, a long, mournful note that hangs in the air, and then, for the first time in history, the clock stops. The city freezes in the light of a dead sun, and the story of the man who tried to catch a shadow is finally, mercifully, erased from the memory of the world. There is only the stillness, the cold, and the end. I breathe in the silence, and I am finally at rest. Yet, in this absolute cessation, there is a final, rhythmic pulse that defies the absolute zero of my existence. It is not the city, nor the tower, but the faint, persistent thrum of a memory that refuses to disintegrate, a singular, defiant echo of the moment I first felt the weight of duty, a spectral warmth lingering in the frost. I realized then that even in the heart of the void, the essence of the investigation remains, a persistent, unkillable ghost that refuses to settle into the dust of non-being. I am the silence that watches the void, the witness that exists after all witnesses have vanished, and in this eternal, frozen threshold, I begin the case again, not to solve it, but to observe the beauty of its own impossibility, tracing the architecture of the nothingness until the very foundations of the dark begin to shimmer with the pale, agonizing light of a brand new, unwritten beginning.